May 1945, only a few days before the end of the Second World War, somewhere in Germany. American soldiers are searching for stolen treasures of the Third Reich in bunkers and mines. Paintings and works of art which the Nazis have looted and collected in 6 years of war. This is where they must be hidden. But the Red Army is also searching. A dramatic race begins. A race for works of art with an immeasurable value. Our story is the story of an idea, the idea of art. It's also the story of power, the story of the desire to possess and control things in a totalitarian state. 1938, during a reception in Linz, Adolf Hitler planned to erect a gigantic museum which is to bear witness to Germany's greatness and the cultural inferiority of all other nations. The project became Hitler's favorite. With his Linz Museum, Hitler wanted to eclipse all museums of the world. An impressive new building was to be erected. In his mind, Hitler had already furnished all the rooms. Hitler would sit in front of the model for days, dreaming. The works of art for the museum were to come from looting and stealing. Hitler's greed is unlimited. Task forces were sent throughout Europe. In the shadow of the war, they began plundering museums and private collections. The number of the stolen paintings went into the thousands. But the tides of fortune turned against the German armies. Germany was now being attacked from the east and the west. Hitler's museum plans had to be postponed for the time after the war. This is where the looted pictures disappeared, here in the Salzkammergut of Austria, deep inside this mountain. Near the small town of Alt-Aussee, there's a salt mine which is more than 700 years old. It was chosen to protect the paintings, which had been looted since the beginning of the war from the bombing raids of the Allied forces. The main problem was how to preserve the art treasures.
Research was done before the paintings were stored here. Long-term research was carried out during a 6-month period where it was discovered that this was absolutely the best room. The works of art don't age here.
In the St. Barbara Chapel of the miners, several hundred meters deep in the mountain, there was a 300-year-old painting in a wonderful condition. Here the experts could see that the works of art would not be damaged by the climate in the mountain. On the 13th of June 1943, Hitler had the mine converted into a depot for his collection of art destined for Linz. Responsible for preserving the works of art in this underground world was one man, Karl Sieber, a small, unassuming restorer of paintings. As were most of the people who worked here, he was also a dedicated lover of art. When they arrived, all the works of art were exactly registered and photographed. The photographer, Eva Frodel-Kraft, recalls.
You had to document and write the numbers of the photographs on the lists and hand them into an archive. That was a well-organized administration job. It was not like, well, here comes a lorry and let's quickly put everything inside somewhere. No, that was a completely organized administrative job which took months. It went on for months and months.
Hundreds, soon thousands of paintings were stored in the mine. Each single shelf was numbered. None of the precious works of art were allowed to get lost. England, the spring of 1944. Preparations are being made for the greatest military operation in the history of mankind. Tens of thousands of tanks and hundreds of thousands of soldiers are already waiting to wrench the command of the European continent from Hitler's grasp. While the soldiers were preparing themselves for the invasion, the educated classes of America were thinking about Europe's works of art. They were worried that the European cities, with their cultural sites of inestimable value, would be destroyed during the advance of the Allied armies and the planned aerial bomb attacks. An Art Protection Commission was established in America. Its job was to make sure that the cultural heritage of Europe was accounted for during the military operations. This, however, required intelligence on the exact location of all the works of art in Europe. New York, Frick Art Reference Library, a private library specializing in art history near Central Park. During the war, this was to become the headquarters of the American efforts to protect European art. Even today, a unique document is kept here, the Frick Atlas of Europe, a work of several volumes which lists all the important art treasures of Europe.
The information came from, in part, the guidebooks that are a very rich component of our collection here at the Frick Art Reference Library. Some were the personal guidebooks of Helen Clay Frick that she'd amassed during her own travels, and some were acquired for the purposes of documenting the photographs in our photo archive here. And then the photo archive itself was very valuable in researching the whereabouts of important works of art that should be protected.
On the 15th of July, 1943, the reading room of the Frick Art Reference Library was closed to the public for the duration of the war. Now all the major works of art of Europe had to be listed. The main source of funds for this ambitious project was the Rockefeller Foundation. In painstaking work, the staff followed up on all the information they were provided with. The works of art were entered on maps of countries and cities. These were then photographed. In the end, more than 700 somewhat unfocused maps were provided to the American Army.
I believe it was from the command central that the maps were studied and used, and therefore the targeting of the Allied bombs was thought through on a fairly high military level, and that was what was then forwarded to the pilots themselves in the bombers.
The 6th of June, 1944. Operation Overlord. The invasion of Normandy begins. After only a few days, the Allies had already secured a bridgehead. Among the divisions which landed, there were also special units whose only task was to search for and rescue works of art. Many of these people had never before worn a uniform or held a gun. In their civilian jobs, they'd been architects, art historians, sculptors and photographers. And now they'd been commissioned by the US Army to work as art detectives. Two of these people were Walker Hancock and Robert Posey. For their work, they used the maps prepared by the Frick Art Reference Library. One of the most important works of art which they were looking for was the Ghent altar from the St. Bavo Cathedral in Ghent in Belgium. It had been stolen by the Germans in 1942. A world-famous work of art, comparable with the Mona Lisa and the Sistine Chapel. The detective work began. The first weeks, however, were frustrating for the American art protection units. The cities and towns in northern France, which the American troops passed through, had been almost completely destroyed by the fierce battles during the invasion. One of the first French cities to be liberated is Caen. Almost 70% of the city had been destroyed. How meaningful is it to search for pictures and other works of art in these ruins? To keep from despairing, you simply had to ignore the hopelessness of the whole situation. Hancock wrote later, "You only had one choice, to keep going." With the advancing Allied troops, the transports to the Alt-Aussee mine in Austria were stepped up. In September 1944, 3 months after the invasion of Normandy, the Ghent altar was brought to the mine. While unloading the altar, the staff discovered that the panel with St. John had been damaged.
The danger was not in the salt mines. The danger was always during the transports, when it rained or snowed and the objects were loaded onto open lorries. So of course they would get wet, and they arrived wet in the salt mine. That was very difficult. There was always a chemist on hand who would examine the objects and look after them.
Karl Sieber decided that St. John had to be restored. The panel was taken to a workshop which he'd set up in the mine where the damage could be repaired immediately. For days on end, Sieber attempted to restore the precious altar wing. The remainder of the altar was stored in the so-called minerals chamber deep in the mountain. For the art lovers among the staff, this was a very moving event.
We then went into the room. There was no electric light there yet, and he held a carbide lamp up because it was completely dark. Suddenly, the Ghent altar shone in the light of the carbide lamp. That was a very moving sight. You mustn't think that I had time to immerse myself in the work of art. It was a sensation that it was even there. Of course, I was very impressed.
Meanwhile, in France, the American art protection officers have not made much progress in their search for works of art. The maps they've been given are more or less useless considering the extent of the war destruction. Many of the works of art which the officers are looking for have either been destroyed or are lost. That's why regular soldiers were also asked to help the art protection officers during their search. They willingly helped out even though they lacked the necessary expertise. They immediately reported any plain country paintings which they found as if it was a world-famous Michelangelo. That's why Walker Hancock was so surprised when one day he was given a message which seemed to reveal unusual expertise. The message said that a broigle had been found in a house. Without hesitating, Hancock immediately went to visit the house. The trip was not very safe as the house from which the broigle had been reported was close to the front. Just the previous day, a battle had been raging here, and German mortars could still hit the place at any time. "My lord, what a war," Walker Hancock would write in his memoirs later. But the trip was worth it. The painting was genuine, probably from the studio of Peter Bruegel the Elder. It had to be removed from the combat zone as quickly as possible. The first great success for Walker Hancock, a pure coincidence. The search continued. However, there were still no traces of the great art collections, including the Ghent altar. August 1944. The German defense lines have finally been broken through. With each day, the Allied armies are getting closer to Paris. Of all places, Chambord Palace on the Loire is being used as an assembly point for the Allied bomber squadrons flying against the German positions. This is where large amounts of art treasures from the Louvre had been stored since the outbreak of the war. Aerial battles took place repeatedly above the chateau. An English plane crashed onto the lawn. The art treasures, however, remained undamaged. Only a few days after the advancing combat troops, the art protection officers arrived at the palaces along the Loire. Their job was to protect the palaces from the marauding troops within their own army. After the grueling battles with the heavy losses, the palaces were especially popular as troop quarters, with often devastating effects for the interior and the furniture. Because the art protection officers were not authorized to stop the actions of their own troops, they had to resort to a simple trick. First, they secured the buildings with so-called off-limit signs, which cautioned the soldiers to proceed with care to protect the art treasures. When this wouldn't help, they resorted to a more severe measure. They would mark the buildings with white tape, the Allied symbol for hidden mines, which proved to be the only really effective warning. Meanwhile, the Germans were getting ready to defend themselves in Paris. Tanks were being positioned throughout the city and trenches were being dug. The German troops were instructed to expect house-to-house fighting and blanket aerial bomb attacks. The Jeu de Paume Museum was located in the heart of Paris. The Germans had used it for many years as a depot for the stolen art collections. Now the remaining paintings were to be brought to Germany before the Allies reached Paris. For years now, the activities of the Germans were being carefully observed by Rose Valland, an unusual woman.
The fact was that she was, in essence, a double agent because she was chronicling very assiduously every work of art that came into the Jeu de Paume, purporting to be doing this on behalf of the Nazis, and much of this in preparation for works of art going to Hitler's museum in Linz.
During the day, Rose Valland would work for the Germans, and at night, she would work for the French resistance. At the end of July 1944, Rose Valland noticed that paintings were being packed into crates and taken to the railway station. In the transport papers, she discovered the wagon numbers of the paintings being removed.
She was very bright and very amusing and civilized, and with her hatred of Nazi-dom as an idea, of course, was absolutely total.
Everywhere in Paris, the resistance was preparing to commit acts of sabotage and passive resistance to disturb and unnerve the German troops. While the works of art were waiting at the Paris railway station to be dispatched to Germany, Rose Valland was able to pass on her information to the French resistance movement. The trains were already queuing up at the railway stations. The train with the looted paintings also had to wait. A whole week passed. Then it would travel for a few kilometers, and then halt again. Mechanical problems. Allegedly, the engine had to be replaced. While the Allies prepared to take Paris, inside the city, an uprising against the Germans began. The German commander disobeyed his orders and thus saved Paris from being destroyed. On the 25th of August, the Germans surrendered to the insurgents and the advancing Allied armies. The Americans and the British had expected to find a starved city with social unrest and outbreaks of disease. But the opposite was the case. The city immediately came to life again. The art protection officers moved into Paris together with the combat troops. They hoped to get the first useful bits of information about the whereabouts of the paintings that had been looted by the Nazis. Here, Rose Valland was seen as being the key expert. However, in the eyes of the Americans, she was also a collaborator who'd worked for the Germans. Could she be trusted? Rose Valland also hesitated. Were the Americans really sincere, or were they planning to loot the works of art themselves and take them over to the United States? The first meeting ended without a result. Then, however, Rose Valland became friends with an art protector in uniform. They would go out for meals together and meet in cafes. Rose Valland became the most important source of information for the Americans.
we had a drawer full of everything. Yes, this went to that monastery, and this went way over there, and this one went there. But all that kind of thing was that she achieved.
The information provided by Rose Valland raised hopes that the lost art treasures had not been destroyed, but rather that they'd been stored in secret depots in the German Reich. The Art Protection Task Force finally had a firm lead. The noose around Germany was also being tightened from the east. In the autumn of 1944, the Red Army crossed the border of the German Reich. What the Americans didn't know, however, was that after his victory in Stalingrad, Stalin had decided to make up for the war damages which the Germans had caused in the Soviet Union by confiscating German cultural assets. He planned to open a museum in Moscow with the looted art. Headed by the Soviet Secret Service, so-called trophy commissions were attached to the Red Army. One of these commissions was headed by Natalia Sokolova. Together with a small staff, she was supposed to search for valuable paintings in Germany, just like the art protection officers from the West. The race for the looted works of art began. The war during the winter of 1944-45. In Alt-Aussee in the Austrian Alps, a state of emergency now existed. Paintings were still being delivered every day, at a great risk.
The lorries drove right up to Alt-Aussee. The winters in Alt-Aussee, however, very severe. 2 or 3 meters of snow are not uncommon here. Works of art were being brought up Steinberg Mountain by special tracked vehicles, which had actually been built for the Russian campaign.
Many of the paintings which arrived were damaged, and the space in the front chambers of the old salt mine was quickly being filled. It became more and more difficult to keep things under control at the mountain.
Although they were being properly stored, we could no longer work with such great care as in the beginning when we were still lining the shelves. The war situation was much more dramatic now.
March 1945, the American army crosses the Rhine. The war was back to where it had started. According to information provided to the American army by Rose Valland, in Siegen, not far from Cologne, there was a mine with a huge art depot. It was now Easter Sunday, 1945. Instead of the works of art, the Americans found civilians, Germans who were hiding in the mountain. Stricken with fear, they were awaiting the revenge of the victors. For them, it was the first encounter with the victorious power. The tunnel went deeper and deeper into the mountain. Would the mine reveal other secrets? Then, in a second tunnel, hundreds of meters deep, the American art protection officers made another discovery. More than 600 paintings from German museums and countless crates with gold and silver jewelry. What they didn't find were the works of art which the Germans had looted from all over Europe. The search for the Ghent altar continues. Meanwhile, Natalia Sokolova was following another lead. She had been ordered to advance towards Dresden. Before the war, the city had housed a world-famous art gallery with countless valuable paintings which Stalin wanted for his collection of looted art. It was not known how many of these works of art had survived the ravages of the war. In April 1945, the Red Army reached the outer districts of Berlin. Hitler retreated into his bunker under the Reich Chancellery. In February, he'd been given the final model of his Linz museum, and now he took it into the underworld with him. While holed up in his bunker, he wrote,
"I never collected my paintings for private reasons, but rather to establish an art gallery in my hometown of Linz on the Danube. It is my greatest wish that this legacy of mine shall be fulfilled."
In the east and the west, the troops of the anti-Hitler coalition once again encountered fierce resistance. The Americans were still unaware of the whereabouts of the Nazis' most important art depot. In Trier, Robert Posey finally gets a vital hint from a former member of the Linz Museum project. The Ghent altar and the other works of art which have been looted for the Linz Museum are located in a salt mine in Alt-Aussee in Austria. On the 19th of March, Hitler had ordered the destruction of everything which could possibly be of use to the enemy. Now, just before Hitler committed suicide, this order was extended to include all works of art.
That was a real dramatic situation because the head of the Nazi administrative district of Upper Austria and the Upper Danube, as it was then called, was a fanatic Nazi who had ordered the mine to be blown up to destroy the works of art that were inside so that the enemy could not get their hands on them.
In Alt-Aussee, everything was being prepared to blow up the mine. Secret crates labeled marble were being brought into the chambers. More than 8,000 of the most valuable works of art from all over Europe were on the verge of being completely destroyed. It was then that the Austrian miners decided to act. They'd heard of art treasures which had been stored in the mountain. They now visited the only man who appeared to be trustworthy enough and who had access to the tunnel, Karl Sieber, the restorer of paintings. He knew every square meter of the tunnel system, and he agreed to join in on the conspiracy. Together, they decided to blow up the tunnel, but in a way which, instead of damaging the paintings, would only block off the entrance to the chambers.
But the miners were able to prevent that. They were, of course, less worried about the works of art than about losing their jobs if the mountain was blown up.
Hätten sie ja ihren Job verloren, denn ein Bergwerk, das zugesprengt ist, kann man nicht.
It would have been very difficult to get the mine going again. That's why the miners, in a dramatic mission, removed the crates with explosives, which the Nazi leader had already taken into the mine. That's why the mountain wasn't blown up, thanks to the locals.
The 7th of May 1945, one day before the war ended. Captain Posey arrived at the salt mine. He was unaware of the plans for blowing up the mine. He only knew that he had to be quicker than the Red Army. The Soviets, however, were unaware of the art treasures hidden in the salt mine. The 8th of May, 1945, the day the war ended, the Red Army entered Dresden. The former Art Center Dresden is a scene of devastation, having been almost completely destroyed by the bombing raids from the 13th of February 1945. Only a few days after the end of the war, the Soviet Trophy Commission, headed by Natalia Sokolova, started to search for the city's world-famous works of art among the ruins. Recalling this later in her writings, Natalia Sokolova said that they almost fainted upon seeing the destruction and smelling the stench of the corpses in the city. In May 1945, many German cities looked like Dresden. For a time, the search for works of art was no longer a priority. However, only a few days later, Natalia Sokolova already had a firm lead. Although the famous art gallery had been destroyed, the paintings had been rescued in time. Her search began. The masterpieces from Dresden's museums had allegedly been hidden in the abandoned tunnel of a mine in the nearby Elbe Sandstone Mountains. Similar to the American art protection officers, the Red Army also had to carry out its search in the catacombs of the Third Reich. Golden frames suddenly appeared in the light of a torch. Natalia Sokolova found almost all the famous paintings of Dresden in this tunnel. Rescued, the famous Ganymed painting by Rembrandt. Another sensational find was the Sistine Madonna by Raphael. On the same day that the Red Army entered Dresden, Captain Posey also arrived at Alt Aussee. After 24 hours, he dug a passage through the blown-up entrance. He was then standing in the middle of the most secret art depot of the Third Reich. He'd found the art collection of Hitler's museum, abandoned and intact. The treasures included the long-lost Ghent altar, hastily packed yet almost undamaged. A total of about 8,000 works of art were found in Alt-Aussee. Not all the paintings had been destined for Hitler's museum in Linz. Paintings from German and Austrian museums, from Berlin and Vienna, were also found.
This is where the works of the greatest European artists had been stored. Whether Michelangelo, Vermeer, Bruegel or Titian, they were all here. When the depot was discovered, the value of the art found here was estimated at $3.5 billion.
The art protection officers had finished their search, yet the mountains still held unexpected treasures.
For a long time it was assumed that an angel from a wing of the Ghent altar had been lost, until one day during an inspection of the tunnel one appeared. It had been turned upside down on two wooden trestles and used as a table by the miners when they were having a tea break. On the back you can still see the cutting marks of the knives they used while they were eating here.
After the fighting had ceased, works of art were found everywhere in the German Reich. In mines, in castles and in cowsheds, as well as in railway wagons, which had simply been abandoned in the middle of nowhere. During the next weeks, Robert Posey, Walker Hancock and their colleagues discovered more than 2,000 such hiding places. The art protection officers were not always treated friendly by the people looking after the art treasures. Sometimes they had to force their way into the secret art depots. Afterwards, they proudly presented what they'd found. The fact that this search for works of art was also used to let countless paintings, sculptures, pieces of porcelain and jewellery secretly disappear into the pockets of GIs and thus end up in the United States wasn't made public. The finds of the US Army were especially plentiful on the Berghof in Berchtesgaden. This is where the great Nazi figures, including Adolf Hitler and Hermann Göring, had their splendid residences, which they furnished with valuable paintings.
Near Berchtesgaden, the 101st Airborne Division uncovers Hermann Göring's personal art collection, hidden in a subterranean chamber. 1,200 artworks worth untold millions are included. The treasures will go back to rightful owners in pillaged nations.
Immediately after the works of art had been secured, the paintings were taken away from Berchtesgaden again, similar to Alt-Aussee. The transport conditions were not much better than when they first arrived.
The first works of art were taken out of the mine on the 10th of May after the trench had been uncovered again. It had been blown up by the miners professionally so that only the entrance was blocked. By the end of 1945, many of the paintings had been taken to a collecting point in Munich, but there were also works of art which were to be stored here for almost 20 years, until the 60s, when restitution issues were clarified, after which they were then finally returned to their rightful owners.
To enable the art treasures to be correctly returned, the US Army had already organized 3 central collecting points for art, the most important one being in Munich. The first works of art from Alt-Aussee and elsewhere arrived here on the 17th of June. Until the end of the year, almost 20,000 works of art were to be deposited initially for an indefinite time in Munich. The staff immediately took up their work. Along with 4 members of the US Army, more than 100 German civilians were also busy listing the paintings. This, however, did not solve the problem of returning the works of art. Often there was no information available about the former owner. One day, Lane Faison gets a visit from an old lady.
Dear sweet lady who wanted her 18th century Paris-style rocking chair. I mean, this kind of chair. I said, well, my dear lady, we probably have 300 of those. There's no possible way of identifying yours. And so you can't have that, we can't just say, take one.
The Americans refused to hand back works of art to private individuals, regardless of how legitimate their claims were. It was only at the Potsdam Conference in July of 1945 that a solution was found. The works of art were to be officially returned to the countries from which they'd been stolen. It was then up to the respective governments to return them to the museums or private collectors as the legitimate owners.
We never dealt with an individual. That's an important point to make. We dealt with the government. We sent things to France, we sent them to the Louvre. We sent things to Belgium, they went to Brussels. The Ghent altar that I keep hearing about, a very, very important small town outside of Brussels. We didn't send it to Ghent. Everybody knew where it came from. No, you establish it to Brussels because it's the capital of the country. And it's their problem, not our problem. And that's the same all the way around.
The Ghent altar was the first work of art to be returned. On the 21st of August, it began its homeward journey on a plane accompanied by Captain Posey, so that it could be back in Belgium by the 3rd of September 1945, in time for the anniversary of the liberation of Brussels. Today, the altar has been returned to the Cathedral of Ghent, where it's displayed behind bulletproof glass as an additional security measure. It's visited by tens of thousands of tourists every year. Its return in 1945 was an act of great symbolic significance, and at the same time, the start of the greatest recovery of stolen art in the history of mankind. East Germany was now being occupied by the Soviets, who followed a completely different policy. 1,700 paintings were taken to the Soviet Union from Dresden alone. In the long run, however, the Soviet Union was in a difficult situation. On the one hand, the looted paintings were looked upon as being a legitimate reparation for war damages, while on the other hand, it made no sense to withhold them from the socialist brother country, the GDR. In 1955, a compromise was reached, with some of the looted art treasures being returned, accompanied by a great propaganda show.
Dresden, just as in former times, after the city had been laid to waste by the Anglo-American terror bomb attacks, Soviet officers and experts rescued the treasures of the art gallery, including the world-famous Sistine Madonna by Raphael, which were in danger of wasting away in the cellar vaults.
After the end of the war, the works of art which had been removed from the Louvre in August 1939 were also returned. This recovery effort took more than a year. Countless works of art had to be returned to their original location. Then, in May 1946, all preparation work was completed. The world's most famous art museum could reopen. The Jeu de Paume Museum in the heart of Paris, where the Nazis had stored looted works of art during the war, was also reopened in 1946. Once again, it became a public art museum. Rose Valland, the heroine of Jeu de Paume, is unforgotten to this very day. After the war, she was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross of the Federal Republic of Germany and the Légion d'honneur Medal of the French Republic for her service to her country.
Here at the library, we are very proud to have one of the very few complete copies of this directory that she put together, which is 8 volumes and vast. Really, to this day, researchers come to the Frick Art Reference Library to consult what Rose Vallon had put together.
Even with the help of the list prepared by Rose Vallon, many of the works of art looted by the Nazis have still not been recovered. They remain missing, either destroyed or hanging in museums, private collections and living rooms without their legitimate owners knowing of their whereabouts. The topic of looted art is still relevant today.